When the veil lifts, the myth no longer binds with the same invisible chains. The empath awakens to the knowledge that the beast was never external, not fully. The devourer was always a reflection of something unclaimed within. The narcissist's insatiable hunger is the mirror of the empath's own refusal to nourish the self. This is the unbearable recognition that the narcissist is not only an external tyrant, but also the embodied projection of the empath's inner shadow. In the unconscious, all figures are doubled. The one who hates is a LSO, the one who loves. The persecutor is also the savior. What you encounter outside is but the manifestation of what lies dormant within. The empath, in giving all to the narcissist, reveals not only compassion but also self-abandonment. And the narcissist, in consuming endlessly, reveals not only cruelty, but also the desperation of a child who never received the breast, never received the gaze of love that would confirm existence. Thus, the empath and the narcissist are locked together not by fate alone but by complementary wounds. Dreams often reveal this hidden dynamic with an image of pursuit. The dreamer runs through endless corridors, chased by a figure who wears many masks, sometimes a lover, sometimes a monster, sometimes a parent. No matter the disguise, the figure always demands, always takes. But if the dreamer turns, if in the dream, the empath stops running and faces the pursuer, the transformation begins. The monster dissolves or collapses into a sobbing child. So too in wacky NG life, when the empath sees the truth, the narcissist loses the aura of invincibility. The beast becomes small, almost pitiful. The endless cycle of chase and escape falters. Yet such recognition is not without terror. To see the narcissist's emptiness is also to see one's own. To recognize that what you were feeding was not a soul but a wound, not love but absence, is to confront the frightening possibility that your own love was never truly received, because it was never truly offered to yourself. The emperor's identity begins to unravel here. Who am I? If I am not the healer of another, who am I? If my worth is not measured by my ability to absorb pain, the collapse of this identity feels like death. For indeed, it is a psychic death. The death of the archetype that has governed life unconsciously. In myth, every death is a descent into the underworld. Epiphany is sized. Inanna is stripped of her garments. Orpheus descends with his lyre. The empath too must descend, not into the narcissist's abyss this time, but into their own. They must face the buried hunger, the neglected child, the repressed shadow that whispers, I too want to be seen. I too want to be loved without condition. This is not a gentle journey. It is a confrontation with the darkest truth that the cycle was sustained not only by the narcissist's hunger, but by the empath's collusion in refusing the self. You see, the unconscious is merciless in its desire for wholeness. It will send us again and again into the same pattern, the same relationship, the same wound, until we are forced to see the hidden face of God within it. What is projected outward must be reclaimed inward. The narcissist becomes the mirror through which the empath finally glimpses the shadow of their own self-abandonment. And when that seeing occurs, the cycle begins to break. Do not imagine, however, that the breaking is sudden or triumphant. It is more like a slow crumbling, a fatigue that deepens until the old compulsion no longer holds. The empire, once inflamed with a need to save now, feels only weariness. They cannot give as before, not because of bitterness, but because the well has run dry. And in that exhaustion, the seed of self-love begins to stir. It whispers, perhaps I too am worthy of the gaze, of nourishment, of love, not given away, but kept within. Here the archetype shifts. The empath ceases to be the redeemer of others and becomes instead the redeemer of the inner child, the healer of the forgotten self. In dreams, this may appear as the image of holding an infant or of discovering a neglected room within a house. In waking life, it manifests as boundary, as silence, as withdrawal from the endless theater of giving and taking. The narcissist, deprived of supply, may rage, may wither, may vanish. But the empath for the first time feels the faint warmth of autonomy. This is what I call the end of the cycle. It is not the destruction of the narcissist nor the triumph of the empire, but the dissolution of the unconscious bond that chained them together. It is the realization that both figures were internal. Both belong to the dream of the psyche. To awaken from that dream is to see the narcissist not as a demon but as a symbol. They were the necessary teacher, the shadow midwife who forced the empath to turn inward and face the unclaimed self. In this awakening, compassion takes a new form. No longer is it the compulsive giving that empties the soul, but the steady recognition that even the narcissist is a child of the collective wound, their hunger, their vanity, their cruelty. These are the masks of an archetypal drama played out through them. The empaths, having stepped out of the cycle, may now see with clarity it was never truly about them. It was always about the dialogue between my soul and its shadow, and so, the end of the cycle is the beginning of individuation. To individuate is to claim both light and darkness, to see that the narcissist was not an enemy but a mirror, not a curse, but a guide into the lab of the self. The empath who once feared losing love discovers a deeper truth that love cannot be lost when it is rooted within. What was once compulsive sacrifice becomes conscious choice. What was once blind entanglement becomes lucid detachment. The wheel turns. The myth dissolves, and in the silence that follows, one hears, perhaps for the first time, the voice of the self, the archetype of wholeness whispering from within. Now you are ready to live not as half of a cycle, but as the whole. And when the empath begins to awaken, there is a peculiar sensation of vertigo, as if the ground that once held the story of their life is no longer solid. The old compass, which always pointed toward another's suffering, no longer gives direction. It is here that the psyche trembles, for it fears the void more than it fears pain. To live without the narcissist, to live without the endless cycle, feels to the unconscious like stepping into nothingness. Yet this version, Oid, is sacred, for in it lies the possibility of the self to emerge. The narcissist once served as the axis around which the empath's identity revolved. Like planets around a black sun, the empire's world orbited the insatiable hunger of the other. But when the gravitational pull collapses, the empire finds themselves drifting in the cosmic sea, unimed, uncertain. This drifting is necessary. It is the dissolution of the old orbit, the dissolution of dependency on a center that was never truly stable. The terror of this space is the terror of freedom. For freedom demands, one must find an inner axis, a center within that does not depend on another's hunger. In analytical psychology, we call this process individuation, but individuation is not a gentle ascent toward light. It is a descent into chaos where the ego dies. Many death. The empath accustomed to playing the role of light-bearer must now step into their own shadow. The shadow whispers truths long denied. Anger that was never spoken. Note, boundaries that were never drawn. Desires that were repressed in the name of purity. These truths rise like ghosts in the night. Dreams become charged with violence, with imagery of fire and blood, of doors locked and keys lost. One may dream of drowning, of suffocation, of being buried alive. These dreams do not mean the soul is dying. They mean the false identity is being dismantled. Let me tell you a dream. I once heard from a patient who bore the archetype of the empath. She dreamed she was carrying a great vessel of water across a desert. The sun scorched her, but still she carried the vessel, for she believed others were dying of thirst. At last she stumbled and fell. The vessel shattered. She wept in despair, for she believed she had failed everyone. Yet as the water seeped into the earth, flowers began to bloom. A voice whispered, "The water was always meant for you." This dream encapsulates the archetypal journey, the realization that what one has carried for others was always meant to nourish the self first. The narcissist thrives only because the empath has not yet learned this truth. When the empath begins to drink of their own vessel, the narcissist panics, for the source of their supply is threatened. Raja erupts, manipulation intensifies. Promises are made and broken in quick succession. But this is the final death rattle of the cycle. Once the empire sees that the narcissist's rage is not power but desperation, the spell is broken. The predator loses its teeth. The once dreaded shadow shrinks back into the smallness of its true origin. The unloved child, the hollow one. Yet beware, the end of the cycle is not the end of narcissists in the world. They will remain as they have always existed, as figures of hunger and shadow in the collective psyche. What changes is not the world but the way the awakened empath perceives it. They no longer project divinity onto the narcissist. They no longer confuse abuse for love. They see with clarity. And in that seeing lies power. The narcissist may still approach, but they find no entrance, for the empath has sealed the door with self-knowledge. There is profound grief. In this stage, one must mourn not only the loss of the narcissist but the loss of the illusion. The empath must grieve the fantasy that love could save another who refuses to face themselves. This mourning is holy, for through it the heart is purified of delusion. Tears flow not for the narcissist but for the years lost, the sacrifices made, the innocence betrayed. In those tears lies liberation, for only by grieving can one be reborn. The archetypes of death and rebirth always come together. The old identity dies, the self begins to emerge. The empath may find new symbols in their dreams: rising suns, bridges across rivers, broken chains, the sudden appearance of animals, wolves, lions, serpents that signify instinct reclaimed. These images announce the return of vitality. The empath who once gave all their energy away now begins to, feel their own life force. It may be terrifying at first, for power feels like danger. When one has lived only in surrender, but gradually the body remembers its strength, the soul remembers its authority. This is not arrogance. True authority is rooted in humility before the self. The empath does not become a narcissist by reclaiming power. They become whole, for within them now lives the balance of shadow and light, giving and receiving, compassion and self-respect. They see that love without boundaries is not love but self-destruction. They learn that saying no can be as sacred as saying yes. From this place, the empath begins to understand the narcissist in a new way, not as a figure to be feared, nor as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an archetype that revealed what was unhealed within. The narcissist becomes a symbol of what happens when the ego refuses to sacrifice to the self, when one constructs a false self so impenetrable that the soul's hunger devours everything around it. This understanding does not excuse the harm, but it transforms the empath's relationship to it. No longer bound, no longer deceived, they walk away not in hatred but in clarity. The cycle ends when projection ends, for projection is the glue of repetition. The empath once projected their own unloved child onto the narcissist, seeing in them someone they could save, someone who needed their endless giving. The narcissist projected their own emptiness onto the empath, seeing in them a fountain that could never run dry. Both were blinded by projection. But when the empath reclaims the projection, when they see the unloved child within themselves and tend to it, the bond dissolves. The narcissist projection has no foothold, for the empath no longer plays the role in this way. The cycle is not broken by force but by sight. The narcissist may continue their patterns elsewhere, seeking new sources of supply, but the awakened empath steps out of the dance. They no longer resonate with the number. The archetype has fulfilled its purpose. The myth has been lived and transcended, and what lies beyond, a strange and luminous peace. It is not the naive peace of untouched innocence, but the heart-won peace of one who has descended into the underworld and returned with wisdom. The empath becomes a guide not by choice but by essence. Their very being radiates the knowledge that one can survive the devourer and be reborn. Others still trapped in the cycle may be drawn to them seeking the secret of liberation, and in gentle words or in silent presence they transmit the truth. You must see. You must turn inward. Only then will the cycle end. And this, my friends, is the mystical paradox. The narcissist, though destructive, becomes the unwilling initiator into individuation. The empath's pain becomes a door through which they meet their shadow, and through the shadow, the self. It is a terrible gift, but a gift nonetheless. For nothing in the psyche is wasted, even the darkest encounter. Can serve the light of wholeness if one is willing to face it without illusion. There is a strange moment after liberation, when silence feels louder than the chains ever did. The empath stepping out of the cycle encounters an emptiness that is both liberating and terrifying. It is like leaving a temple where one has worshipped for years, only to find the altar abandoned, the incense burned out, the god gone. One asks, who am I without the narcissist, without the wound, without the story that bound me? This question is not rhetorical. It is the cry of the soul demanding a new orientation. For the emperor's previous life was shaped by archetypal gravity, the savior bound to the devourer. To step beyond that myth means to wander in the wilderness, stripped of the old garments. And it is in this wilderness that the psyche, no longer distracted by the narcissist's endless hunger, finally hears its own voice. That voice is soft at first, like a whisper in a storm, but it grows clearer with every act of listening. The myths of old speak to us here. consider the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld. She was queen of heaven and earth, clothed in jewels and robes of power. Yet at each gate of the underworld, she was stripped of a garment, stripped of a crown, until she stood naked before her shadow sister, Arkell. This is the image of the empath after leaving the cycle. The titles, the garments of identity healer, give a rhymer fall away, leaving only the bare soul before the abyss. The confrontation is unavoidable to stand before, to face the dark sister who represents all that was repressed. Janet, hidden for the empath, is the unlived self, the one who says no, the one who desires fiercely, the one who rages when violated. To integrate her is to accept that love is not always gentle, that compassion without strength is not wholeness but martyrdom. Without this acceptance, the empath risks being pulled back into the cycle, for the unconscious will recreate the pattern until the shadow is claimed. But with this acceptance, something miraculous occurs. The empath does not merely escape the narcissist. They outgrow the archetypal bond entirely. What does it mean to outgrow an archetype? It means that the psychic energy once trapped in repetition is liberated for individuation. Energy that once went into feeding the narcissist now flows into creation, into authentic relationships, into the flowering of the self. It is as though a river once dammed and diverted returns to its natural course, watering the inner landscape. Dreams may now show gardens, rivers, mountains, symbols of the fertile psyche. The empath begins to sense purpose not as duty to another, but as alignment with the deeper order of the soul. And yet let us not underestimate the cunning of the unconscious. Even as liberation unfolds, there is temptation to return. The narcissist may appear again, or a new figure may emerge bearing different clothes, but carrying the same hunger. This recurrence is not failure. It is the psyche testing the new foundation. Will you, the empath, fall back into the old role, or will you stand firm in the new recognition? Each test deepens the integration, for wholeness is not achieved in a single epiphany, but in repeated acts of conscious choice. I recall another dream told by one who had walked this path. She dreamed she was in a grand theater, and on the stage stood a man who demanded her devotion. His voice was thunderous, his presence commanding all around her. People knelt and applauded. She felt the old compulsion to kneel too, but then she noticed that the man's feet were made of clay, crumbling, unstable. In that instant, she turned and walked out of the theater. The crowd gasped. The man shouted, but she kept walking until she stepped into sunlight. This dream reveals the moment when the projection collapses. The god mask of the narcissist falls away, revealing fragility. The empath's refusal to worship is the true liberation. From this point forward, the empath's life becomes an unfolding of new possibilities. Creativity blossoms. Relationship deepen. Solitude no longer feels like exile but sanctuary. The empath learns that love is not a finite resource to be drained but an infinite wellspring. When rooted in the self, they begin to love differently. Not compulsively, not sacrificially, but with clarity and reciprocity. Such love is not blind. It sees the other fully, shadow and all, yet remains anchored in truth. The narcissist, in contrast, remains bound to their archetype unless they too face their shadow. But the empath no longer waits, no longer sacrifices in hope of change. They understand that each soul must choose its own descent, its own confrontation with the underworld. Compassion remains, but it is no longer self-annihilating. It is the compassion of one who has walked through fire and knows the path but does not drag others across. Here too lies a warning. The empath who has awakened must guard against the pride of the redeemer archetype returning in disguise. To believe oneself enlightened, superior, unabashed is to fall into another form of illusion. True wholeness is humble. It recognizes that the cycle was necessary, that even the narcissist served the larger purpose of the self's unfolding. There is no need for hatred nor for superiority. There is only the quiet recognition. I have seen the truth, and the truth has set me free. And what is this truth? That the narcissist was never the true enemy nor the true lover. They were the mask of an archetype, the vessel of projection, the necessary initiator. The real battle was always within. The empath's refusal to claim their own shadow, their own hunger, their own power. Once claimed, the cycle ends. The narcissist is revealed not as master but as mirror. The empath emerges not as victim but as whole. Thus, the wheel completes its turn. The end of the cycle is the beginning of individuation, and individuation is not the end of suffering but the end